a lot of the leftist activists that you see today. His Rules for Radicals has been used time and time again, and it's still being used. I remember watching the presidential debate in 2008, and Barack Obama was using Rules for Radicals against John McCain, and I'm sitting there watching it going, don't fall for it, but we always fall for the trap. One of the things that Alinsky says is to isolate the enemy, and we've seen that time and time again on our side, especially with James O'Keefe. I've seen the where they'll try to put him up there and put him out there and just let him sink or swim, and that's what the left wants us to do. These are the type of tactics that can be used over and over again. So I suggest anyone to go out there and read Rules for Radicals. Alinsky infiltrated the Catholic Church, he infiltrated organizing, and his tactics are still being used today.
One of the quotes from Rules for Radicals is, the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. You know, don't let any crisis go to waste, and the left is great at that. James, tell us the most effective tactic the left uses against the right.
I think the most effective tactic is to make their enemy live up to their own book of rules. They've been doing this for probably a few decades, very effectively, most particularly with Christians. That they're hypocrites, that they're extremists. I think that the right does not do this to the left, as well as the left does it to the right. They focus on the logical extreme of a particular issue. And that's how they caricature, satirize, and destroy the right. We at Project Veritas have tried to do that to the left and to our subjects, whether it be Planned Parenthood with Margaret Sanger, Acorn with child prostitution, voter fraud, dead people voting. We try to focus on the logical extreme of an issue, but in our case, usually it's typically what they do all the time. It's not really the extreme. But I think making them live up to their own book of rules and ridicule are the two most effective Alinsky tactics.
And I will just add something to what James said. I think the most effective response to the polarization and the driving to extremes that James mentions is what Ronald Reagan did in his 1964 speech, A Time for Choosing. He had one of the best lines I've ever heard in politics. He said, "We are often told that we must make a false choice between left and right." He said, "I don't believe politics is horizontal. I believe it is vertical. Rather than left or right, let's talk in terms of up or down. Down to the ante of totalitarianism, or up to the maximum degree of freedom consistent with order." This is not a left-right debate. This is common sense versus insanity.
I'll get killed if I don't do this. Each of you was given a survey when you walked in. When this is done, if you're leaving them on the back table when you leave, I'll still have a job tomorrow. John, tell us about your new book and what it's centered on.
Actually, I'll come to the podium if that's all right.
Excellent.
All right. We are told that Mitt Romney isn't answering every question put to him. What was 2008, with Barack Obama refusing to answer any question about where he was, when, who he was, and what he believed in? Now, there were a few exceptions. In 2007, the Washington Post quoted Obama as saying, "I embraced many of Alinsky's tactics, and his years as an organizer gave him the best education of his life." In other words, his chief mentor was Saul Alinsky. Well, we now know a lot more about Barack Obama because Stanley Kurtz, who's written a wonderful book called Obama's War Against the Suburbs, and the new documentary by Dinesh D'Souza, which will premiere in your theaters August 10th, called 2016 Obama's America, has ripped away the curtain. We now know that Barack Obama was a radical for most of his political life. His first job in politics after he was a community organizer was as director of voter registration for Project Vote. Anita will tell you, Project Vote and Acorn were joined at every bodily part. He did such a good job running a voter registration campaign for Acorn, and you know what that means, that they made Obama, Acorn, not Project Vote, made Obama their top organizer for the city of Chicago. their top seminar speaker. He did such a good job with that, he became their lawyer. He was Acorn's lawyer. There was a bill signed into law by Bill Clinton. The first bill he signed into law in 1993 was called the Motor Voter Law. It created the template for all the voter fraud we're seeing in this country, because it forced every state to allow people to register by postcard without ever showing up, and there was no check as to whether or not they were a citizen, whether or not they were living at the correct address, whether or not they were even existing. And it also blocked the states from cleaning up their voter rolls. To this day, many states have 15 or 20% of their voter rolls filled with deadwood, people who don't exist, people who've moved out of state, people who died. In fact, in the city of Philadelphia, there are more registered voters than there are adults over the age of 18, according to the Census Bureau. We call that a clue. Barack Obama won the case that solidified voter into federal law. He created a template for the voter fraud that he may now preside over. Now in 2008, Obama would run away from Acorn as much as he possibly could. I have nothing to do with these people. It turned out his primary campaign against Hillary Clinton hired 2 Acorn affiliates for voter outreach and voter registration efforts in Pennsylvania and Ohio, but they disguised those payments as staging and lighting, almost as if it were for a rock concert. But it was Acorn that Obama turned to when he needed them most in 2008. Now Barack Obama's Injustice Department, run by Eric Holder, is suing every state. They are challenging states in passing voter ID laws that aren't even covered by the Voting Rights Act. Pennsylvania is an example. The reality is Pennsylvania's voter ID law won't prevent anyone from voting, even if they don't have an ID. It asks you for a photo ID. If you don't have one, you can still vote. You vote a provisional ballot. It's set aside. You then can go back and prove your identity. If it turns out that you signed a declaration saying, I don't have the money to get the documents necessary to get the free photo ID, they will still count your vote. What Eric Holder is doing is destroying people's confidence in the integrity of our elections, and he knows it, and he has known it ever since he let those new Black Panthers off the hook. We have to win in November, not just with a margin of victory, but with a margin beyond litigation. The Democratic National Committee has recruited 10,000 lawyers to gum up the works, to protest, to contest. You think Florida 2000 Bush v. Gore was bad? They will have 10,000 lawyers trying to create 5 Floridas, 6 Floridas, 7 Floridas. If you don't believe me, in 2004, we know from the memoirs of Kerry campaign aides that if Ohio had just been a little bit closer, even though John Kerry lost by several million votes in the popular vote, even if Ohio had been just a little closer, John Kerry and John Edwards, yes, we can't make them forget, he was their vice presidential candidate. Talk about bad vetting. John Kerry and John Edwards were this close to launching their shark attack lawyers to gum up the works in Ohio, contest the election, and throw this country into constitutional chaos. We can't allow that to happen. And I'll close with this. If you don't believe voter fraud can make a difference, I give you the case of Senator Al Frankenstein. I'm sorry. Senator Al Franken, who was certified, I didn't say he won, he was certified the victor in Minnesota in the 2008 Senate race by 312 votes. Well, we now know that he provided the 60th vote to break filibusters to pass Obamacare in the U.S. Senate. If Al Franken had not been seated, we would not have Obamacare in its current form today. Think about that. Now, we know a lot more about that election since it was certified. Thanks to a group called Minnesota Majority, we now have the names and the addresses and the location of 1,200 people who were illegal felons voting in that election. Now, we can't, because it's a secret ballot, we don't know for sure how they voted. But when Fox News' Eric Shawn went out and interviewed 10 of them at random, 9 of them gave the same answer, Al Franken. Now, here's the real story. Of those 1,200 voters, it's almost impossible to convict them, because Minnesota law says all you have to do is say, oh, I made a mistake. I didn't know I couldn't vote. You can't be prosecuted because you didn't have intent. They can only prosecute people who are stupid enough to say, I knew I shouldn't vote and I voted anyway. But even with that restriction, 177 people have been convicted of voting illegally in that election. Convicted! There are dozens more in the pipeline. We may yet come to the point where more people will have been convicted illegally in voting in that Al Franken election than Al Franken's supposed margin of victory. And if anyone ever tells you there is no voter fraud, point to all of those convictions, not indictments, not accusations, convictions of illegal voter fraud in a U.S. Senate race that was crucial to the future of this country and control of 1/6 of this economy by 312 votes, and it was stolen by illegal votes. You can prevent that. There's a group called True the Vote. It's mentioned in my book. They plan to have hundreds of thousands of volunteers monitoring the elections, monitoring the absentee ballots where the real fraud goes on. And I'll be signing my book at 4:30, as I mentioned, in the Columbia lobby. I'd be happy to chat with you. By the way, many of the stories in this book came from you and folks like you. So you're my sources. And one piece of good news. Vote fraud is just like shoplifting. If you talk about it, but you let people know someone is watching, you reduce the incidence dramatically. We have studies that show between 20 and 40% of shoplifting goes away if there's signs up that say don't shoplift. We prosecute shoplifters. There's a camera there even if no one is watching the camera. We can do the same thing with voter fraud. Just talking about it and letting someone know someone is watching can reduce voter fraud by 20 to 40% even before we do anything. Thank you very much.
Anita, since we're on the subject of voter fraud, why does the photo ID debate center so much on race?
One of the things that the left likes to do is they like to work in these minority communities because it provides sort of a shield. And the same thing goes for photo ID. By saying that black people don't have photo IDs, by putting them as the victim in this whole debate, they're trying to shut it down. They do this all the time. And it's kind of ridiculous because most blacks have photo IDs if you go to any area across the country. I live right here in PG County, Maryland, and in the minority communities it's very hard to function. Just to tell you this before I go off, but it's very hard to function without an ID. There's not a lot of banks in these areas, so people are going to check cash in places where they require you to have an ID. They're worried about loss prevention, so if you use your credit card, you have to show an ID. If you want to return a dress for $25 to Dress Barn, they want you to show an ID. These minority communities function that way. So really, it's absurd. And when you turn it back on them, they understand that it's absurd, but it's the only argument they have. Because if you take away the racial component, if you take away the fact that they like to call it a poll tax, and you offer it for free, then what do they have to argue with you about? Nothing. Who can be against free and fair elections? Who can be against one citizen, one vote? The only thing that they can use is the race card, and they've used it so effectively over the years, it's all they have. And even right now, when the debate is so ridiculous, they're clinging to it because they're hoping to stir up those tensions in the minority communities to where minorities will get up and say, you don't want us to vote, you're racist, you hate us, whatever. It's the same argument they've been using over and over again. But if you take that away, if you look at what happened in Georgia, after they passed photo ID, they predicted that the minority vote would go down dramatically. It actually increased. When you look at what's going on in Rhode Island, there were minority Democrat senators that actually pushed that photo ID bill through because they wanted it, because most blacks are tired of having their votes stolen.
I just want to add one bit of context to these excellent remarks. Look, voter ID is so popular in America with the general population, not with pundits and not with politicians. It is so popular, the margins hit 80%. A pollster told me, voter ID is more popular than motherhood or apple pie because some people are estranged from their mothers and some people don't like apple pie. Bottom line, 2/3 of African Americans and Hispanics support photo ID. In fact, Rasmussen asked the following question: do Do you think voter ID is a serious or somewhat serious problem? 63% of whites said serious or somewhat serious, 64% of African Americans. The reason is this, as Artur Davis, the former Democratic congressman from Alabama, has told us, he just quit the Democratic Party because he couldn't put up with it anymore, the lies about voter fraud. He said the following: the biggest victims of voter fraud in this country are minority citizens in inner cities who are crushed by a political machine that takes away their future. It just gives them horrible schools, horrible infrastructure, horrible public services, condemns them to dependency, and anytime they fight back, their election is stolen out from under them. In Detroit, Kwame Kilpatrick, the Democratic African mayor who until recently was serving in federal public housing, he was re-elected narrowly over a reformed minority Democrat. The absentee ballot stole that election. The city clerk of Detroit was replaced after the election, but it was too late. Kwame Kilpatrick continued to misrule that city until the FBI wiretaps caught up with him. Don't let anyone say this is racist. What's racist is continuing to allow big city machines to crush the hopes of minority parents.
Follow up on that a little bit. Anita, why is it that so many nonprofits focus on minority communities?
One of the reasons why that I think one of the reasons why I think nonprofits are in minority communities is because it's easy. You go into these communities, and in the case of Acorn, they were the first people that ever knocked on those doors and asked people what they thought, asked their opinion. They set themselves up as the representatives, or as Brandon Darby would like to say, the so-called black leaders. But they weren't the leaders, but they were the people out there using the minorities to gain power. And when Acorn talked about power, they weren't talking about, fighting poverty, or ending whatever. The money was in the fight. These organizations were getting upwards of $20+ million per organization, and Acorn had over 360 organizations. So imagine how much money is going into fighting poverty and ending whatever. And so what you have is they're taking Republican dollars during the Bush years and the Reagan years, and they're going out there and they're saying, these people don't care about you. They hate you. They're racist. You have to have a victim. One, that's how the left operates. You have to have a victim. And at the same time, you have to have a boogeyman. You have to have something that the people fear, that the man is holding you down, that type of oppression. And that's what we see. When Wade Rathke wrote his community organizing manual in the 70s, it's the same one that they were using up until 2008. And they would go into these communities and find out the past racial tensions and the issues, and they would capitalize on those. It was always about bringing up that past anger, because blacks are not socialists. You're not going to find a lot of black people that are going to try to radically overthrow the government. It's not what we do. But when you go in these communities and you talk about, what Obama called it, spreading the wealth around, or what's fair and what's right, you get the people stirred up because you start talking about reparations and slavery and Jim Crow, and they don't understand the history that most of that comes from the Democrats, so they get upset. Then they give them a sign and they go and tell them, put them on a bus and give them a Lunchable, and next thing you know, they're out in front of somebody's house protesting. They're using these people because the people don't have a voice. Think about that mother that's been on welfare her entire life. She's never had a title or a position. You come in there and you make her chief organizer of her precinct, and all of a sudden, she's got power. People are coming to her, people are talking to her. So she's, of course, talking up that organization, getting more members, and they're getting stronger and more powerful. And the next thing you know, they have a man in the White House.
James, what would you say is the biggest threat to conservatism and the biggest misconception about the right?
The biggest threat to conservatism and the biggest misconception about the left. Let's follow up on Anita's point about ID and about sort of how these people are disenfranchised. We went to Vermont a few months ago and went into a bar in Burlington, Vermont, and attempted to order a beer without photo ID. And we just wouldn't leave until I can't go to the DMV, I can't afford to get a driver's license, I can't take the time out of my schedule. And they actually called the police on us. So
it's got it on tape too, it's pretty funny.
It's on tape, it's on YouTube. The same guy, his name is John Buckley, who did that, who the cops were called on him for ordering a beer and not having ID, went to Attorney General Eric Holder's own poll location and was offered the Attorney General's ballot to vote. And no cops were called. In fact, the authorities, the DC Board of Elections, investigated me.
Yes.
But the biggest way to expose all that is to simply catch it on tape and to juxtaposition the two together. And anyone with, as John says, common sense can look at those facts. They're not policy prescriptions, they're not opinions, they're facts. It is a matter of fact that anyone can walk into the Attorney General's full location and be offered his ballot, an African American's ballot given to a white male. So I think the biggest threat facing the conservative movement is people just don't have any balls.
I'm glad somebody finally said that.
Obviously, that does not include people in this room.
As a follow-up to that, James, because I mean, you've done some incredible things. What advice would you give to citizen journalists and to others that want to kind of follow your path in exposing the lie?
My advice would be to focus on facts. Stop telling people the way you think ought to be. You don't need to go that far. All you do is expose the facts. The facts are so outrageous. Here's what I found. If you expose facts, people that disagree with you will begin to agree with you. I have people who are college students. I have people who are of all stripes, persuasions, cultural affiliations. I've got musicians. I've got filmmakers who look at these videos and they laugh. They're entertained. They're enlightened. They think that's outrageous. These union officials are talking about digging holes and filling them back in again. That's outrageous. Whereas if you tell them, I think we ought to, get rid of Obama because he's a socialist, half the people will disagree with you. But if you say, hey, check this out, someone's calling the cops because I tried to order a beer without ID, but I was given the most powerful person in the country. His ballot was offered to me. So I think focus on the facts. The other thing is make the government react to you. Oftentimes we react to government. We allow them to set the narrative. Well, in every single one of our investigations, a government official has reacted to us. And that's what journalism is all about. It's about exposing the truth and then having the powerful people listen to you, react to you. Anything. Every single voter fraud investigation we've done. Vermont, they investigated me. DC, they investigated me. New Hampshire, they issued me a criminal grand jury subpoena. The guy who issued the criminal grand jury subpoena, I'm not making this up, his name is Richard Head. And now everyone's having this, funny...
His enemies call him Dick.
They'll probably get wind of this discussion and get angry. But the point is that the way to change the world is to expose facts. Focus on the facts and stop debating people. There's nothing to debate. The truth is the truth. Focus on the facts that outrage people, and that's how you'll change people's hearts and minds.
And the other thing is, even if you don't ever pick up a video camera, even if you don't ever attend a meeting and take notes, you can be a citizen publisher. The most important reason that people vote a certain way is if they've had a conversation or contact with their friends, their relatives, their neighbors, their family, and actually had a real-life conversation about this country and where it's going. If you see something you really think is good, something that James has done, something that Anita has written, send it to your email list. You can be your own publisher. And send it to people, maybe on the fence, who are independent, and say, check this out. In other words, if you give them the facts, that may be all they need. Because there are a few people on the fence that are going to decide this election. And all we have to do is turn out the ones who are most motivated and convince a few of the ones who are most undecided. And I have to tell you, if the people in this room execute that plan, this election is in the bag. That's
something that I feel very strongly about. We need to start supporting each other. I have seen so many times, and I feel very passionately about this, guys. I have seen so many times the demise, the death, the end of James O'Keefe. And I see how we sit back and we watch and we wait. It's like he's in the middle of the ocean. And if he makes it to the shore, great, we love him. But if he drowns, oh well. That's not right. When people stick their necks out there, we need to support them. We need to have their backs. We need to be their biggest defenders. You know, if he's not getting on Fox because they're scared, we need to be writing to all of these different places and telling them, we need these stories out there. Why aren't you covering this? Why is this on the front page? Longest few months since Andrew Breitbart died, and I will tell you, it's really hard when you had someone who said, what, they're messing with you? Let's go to war. And now all of a sudden they're like, oh, we love you, Anita, but let me check with my lawyer, I'm gonna get back to you. It's not right. So I just want to make sure we understand we have to support our people. Not everyone's meant to be a warrior, but everyone's meant to be part of the army.
Change James's terminology to grow some Breitbarts. Talk about some of the political theater and the street theater that's out there that's so effectively used by the left.
Anita might be more of an expert on the left's use of street theater.
This one, let's think about it this way. You remember that, I can't remember, it was a banking executive's home, his child was home by himself, and all of a sudden you had all these SEIU people out on his front yard protesting and everything, or this kiss-in that's going in at Chick-fil-A. These things are street theater. They're not meant to really affect anything. It's just to get the TV cameras out there. It's to sway emotion. It's to provide a reaction. They're hoping someone's going to flip out of that Chick-fil-A when they see two gays kissing and they catch it on YouTube, and next thing you know, see the hate that the right wing brings to us. Or I remember the protest against Sherwin-Williams from Acorn trying to get the lead out. They didn't want to get the lead paint out of those homes. We had Acorn documents that said Sherwin-Williams was willing to take the lead paint out, but they weren't willing to give any money. So the protests were out there to shake them down and to get that money. And you're going to see the same thing with the Occupy people. All these protests and all this anarchy is to produce a reaction, is to cover up what's going on behind the scenes. So when we're over here looking left, they're moving right. And we need to be aware of that. So don't pay so much attention as to what they're doing. Try to figure out why. What are they trying to cover up? What are they trying to hide? What are they trying to distract you from? Or what type of reaction are they trying to elicit? And that's how we can kind of counter their tactics, because we're so busy reacting to them, we're not looking to see what's really going on behind the scenes, and we miss the big picture.
And another thing you can do is just present the facts, as James says. You know, someone sent me a photograph of the giant Tea Party rally on the mall in Washington, D.C. afterwards. Almost every piece of litter had been picked up. Yes. Then they pictured an Occupy encampment. We all know what that looked like. I think the Occupy movement backfired on them, because they created it, but it got ahead of them. Basically, the anarchists and the slobs and everybody, and frankly the robbers and the thieves took over, and it basically went bust, because as soon as the really bad weather hit, the Occupy people all retreated to their home headquarters, which was their mother's and father's basement.
Speaking of Occupy, Anita, you want to talk about Occupy the DNC for a minute?
Yes. We're going to be down in Charlotte for the DNC convention, and we're having what we're calling Liberty Stop 2012, Occupy the DNC. We're bringing training, we're going to have music. It is, while the DNC is focusing on everything that divides us as Americans, we're going to focus on everything that unites us. If you love liberty, if you love the Constitution, if you love this country, then you're invited to come out for a couple of days of fun and training that will get us ready for the last 60 days of the election. James will be there, Jennifer Savano, we've invited John Fund, and we want everyone just to come out and get ready. This is our call to action. This is our war, and we're taking it to their backyards.